one Wednesday afternoon, Meg and I were driving south on Highway 101 from Mendocino County, where we'd gone for a couple of days of quiet retreat time. And just south of Hopland, we passed a CAL FIRE station with a big signboard. The rain was pelting against the windshield. And on the signboard, there was a little needle that said, "Today's fire danger, low." And we looked at each other and said, "You think?" The rain has come again, California. And it sort of feels like when the church decided that the first Sunday of Advent was the beginning of the new year, maybe they had California in mind. The danger of wildfires feels like it's been lifted from our hearts and minds again for at least a few months. And if you go out and walk in your backyard or somewhere beyond where the pavement ends here in Petaluma, you will see everywhere the tiny green shoots, the seeds from last spring's grasses and weeds sprouting up. And we can imagine that more rain may come, and with it the reservoirs will be filled, those grasses will grow tall, and the land will be fruitful. From these tiny seeds of hope, these little green shoots springing up, we can open our minds to imagine a fullness of blessing in the months ahead. And this is what Advent is about for us. It's about opening our imaginations to the possibility that God is coming to us again, coming to God's people anew, and that from the tiniest seeds of hope that we see sprouting here and there amid so much struggle, so much pain and suffering and darkness and despair in the world, that there is still hope for the fullness of God's blessing of peace for us and for everyone. So it was that the author of the second part of the book of Isaiah, writing in exile in Babylon, could imagine a God who would say to the people, "Comfort, oh comfort my people," could speak tenderly to the people of Israel who had suffered such terrible violence and hardship, who were oppressed and in exile from their home, that the prophet could imagine that a highway through the desert, that the mountains would be made low and the canyons would be lifted up, and that there would be a smooth runway, so to speak, for God to land and come like a good shepherd and carry the people home, carry the lambs and the mother sheep in God's own arms of everlasting love. That the prophet could imagine that that word of God that had been spoken the people before in times of slavery in Egypt could speak again. A word that would endure, of a hope and a promise of peace that would endure when the grass of that generation had grown up and withered in the summer's heat. And in the same way, the author of the Gospel of Mark, writing some 40 years after the death of a rabbi and prophet from Nazareth in Galilee named Jesus, could imagine and dare to set down on paper the story of Jesus as if it were God's proclamation of victory. Because that's what our word gospel means. The Greek word evangelion comes from the sort of proclamation that the herald of the emperor might make after a great battle had been won. And John, or the author of Mark, began by saying the beginning of God's proclamation of victory in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That from those tender shoots of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the fullness of God's blessing had been manifested. The fullness of God's promise of peace to the world had been made good. The Gospel of Mark then continues by remembering that word that God spoke to Isaiah. And indeed, words spoken in the book of Exodus and in the book of Malachi, and stitched those together to give us this quotation about, "See, I am sending my messenger, my angel ahead of you to prepare your way." And this other part about, how does it go? I'm forgetting. The part that's actually a quotation from the book of Isaiah. And Mark could put these together creatively in a new way to give a new word, a new seed of hope to that community to which Mark was writing. In times of great distress and confusion and turmoil and violence. We don't know for sure when it was that Mark set out to write for the first time in the history of the world a gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ as a written document, God's proclamation of victory in the person of Jesus. But most scholars imagine that it was either right before or immediately after or perhaps during the great Jewish revolt and the war between Rome and the Jewish rebels in Judea. Times, I say, of great violence and confusion and turmoil and conflict, not unlike the time in which we live. Yet it was in that hour that Mark could say the beginning of the good news, the beginning of God's proclamation of victory in Jesus Christ. So every Advent we go back to this beginning, this humble seed of hope, this promise that God can and does and will come in their hour of need to God's people, like rain falling on the earth, tender seedling of love and hope. And in our imaginations, we can see in this proclamation the fullness that the epistle reading from 2 Peter speaks to us of today, of God's creation of a new heaven and a new earth where justice finds a home. So that's our job, to go out from this place into the streets of Petaluma, into our workplaces, into our schools, into our neighborhoods, and look for those little shoots of hope, to speak to people from that open imagination, can see in these humble beginnings the fulfillment of a promise that outlasts every spring, and every summer, and every winter, is continually renewed.